Hello. I am Alon Burstein, visiting assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and Israel Institute fellow at the University of California, Irvine, here bringing you a summary of the last 24 hours of the Israel-Hamas war. It is currently the afternoon of January 22nd, 2024 in the United States, the evening of January 22nd, 2024 in the Middle East. Starting with the hostage situation, Al Arabi Al-Jadid reported today that both Egypt and Qatar are hoping to enlist the United States to apply pressure on Israel to enter negotiations regarding a phased plan to end the war. The report added that Egyptian intelligence officials have stressed to Israeli negotiators that negotiations cannot focus solely on the hostages, which is what Israel wants, and that Hamas is insisting that while it is willing to compromise on the stages of the ceasefire, it insists that by the end of the truces, the IDF will completely withdraw from the Gaza Strip and the war will be over. Related to this, in a meeting today with the family members of hostages, Prime Minister Netanyahu stated that Israel is willing to pay a high price that Hamas would demand in a hostage exchange, but is not willing to stop the war, since that would include guarantees that Israel could not violate and then start the fighting again. He stated that there is no Hamas plan that is actually put forth, but that Israel has been developing a proposal that has been presented to negotiators. After this report, Israel's Channel 13 reported that since Netanyahu mentioned the proposal that Israel put forth, military censorship in Israel allowed publication of part of Israel's proposal. According to the report, Israeli plan includes 3 to 4 stages of hostage exchanges and a truce, in which Israel will agree to release heavy Palestinian prisoners, quote-unquote, and even redeploy IDF forces in the Gaza Strip and evacuate certain city centers, but without assurances of ending the war. According to the report, in terms of the hostages, the phase that Israel has put forth is releasing hostages in 3 different stages. The first one is releasing live women and elderly men. The second would be releasing young men that are held by Hamas. And the third would be releasing soldiers and the dead bodies of hostages that are held by the organization. Related to this, Finance Minister in Israel, Bezalel Smotrich, stated today that the government's responsibility is to avoid the next massacre, and thus the simple answer to Hamas's terms of ending the war are an unequivocal no. Other news related to the hostage situation, despite Prime Minister Netanyahu's continuous guarantees that he had assurances that Qatar would verify that the medicines from the medical deal reached the hostages, Israel has yet to receive any confirmation that any transferred medicines from the medical deal actually reached the hostages. Moving on to the fighting in the Gaza Strip, there's no reports of rockets or missiles that were sent from the Gaza Strip towards Israel. However, I will add that today I'm doing the report for the first time earlier, so it's actually covering less amount of time, so there may be rockets still sent tonight. Regarding the fighting in the Gaza Strip, the northern parts of the Gaza Strip and Jabalia refugee camp, the IDF is continuing its activity and searching house to house, according to reports uncovering major weapon storages in almost 50% of the different residential houses. The IDF also took over Hamas's El Jabari outpost in the last several days, uncovering substantial training facilities, including training in underground tunnels, swimming pools that were used for nautical training for Hamas Marines, as well as a simulator for mortar fire and gun battles and things like that. According to the IDF, the outpost, after being excavated, was completely destroyed. Other news related to the north, photo images emerged today showing a busy market area in Jabalia refugee camp, with different commentators stating that this is additional indications that as the IDF is thinning its force in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip, civilian life is beginning to reemerge. The reports in the last several days are that Hamas has sent its own officials, including police officers and different providers of social services, to start assuming some governing responsibility in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip. Now, according to reports, markets are beginning to open as well. According to different estimates, 150,000 Palestinian civilians remained in the northern parts of the Gaza Strip throughout this war. Moving on to the central parts of the Gaza Strip, there were continued fighting today in the different central camps, specifically in El Bureij, El Nusrat, and El Maghazi refugee camps. However, the main reports come from the Nusrat or Nesarim corridor. So this is the main corridor that divides the Gaza Strip between the north, what is considered the northern parts, and the southern parts. And the line has been held by the IDF. And according to reports, the IDF is beginning to set up stationary units there, making this the first territory that the IDF is starting to actively occupy and deploy in a stationary manner. According to reports, 2 checkpoints have been established on the corridor, one in the Salah ad-Din road and one in the coastal road. So these are the roads that go from north-south to the Gaza Strip. And then in the checkpoints, humanitarian trucks are inspected as well as ambulances. And these checkpoints also are meant to facilitate Palestinian civilians who can still travel south in the Gaza Strip but cannot travel back up north. The IDF is reportedly flattening areas around the corridor in order to facilitate the holding of territory, and is currently debating establishing outposts in those 2 checkpoints. Right now, that is still being debated. also reported that there were intelligence warnings coming into the IDF of terror activity that is going to start aiming towards these corridors from Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, specifically noting that this type of activity matches more the type of activity that usually challenges the IDF in stationary occupation areas, such as either suicide attacks, car bombs, or ambushes against stationary IDF forces. Moving on to the southern parts of the Gaza Strip, there was substantial expansion of fighting in Khan Yunis in the last 24 hours. The IDF reportedly launched a major operation into the western parts of the city, where it has not operated yet. The operation involves different IDF brigades that are surrounding the western refugee camps of the city and the outskirts and are gradually moving in. Under heavy gun battles, they're reported both in the outskirts and within the center of the western parts of the city as well. Prior to the invasion, major airstrikes and artillery fire was noted. Palestinian reports stated between 40 and 65 people were killed in these bombings. This expansion comes as the IDF reported that it has already dismantled Hamas's northern and eastern brigades, and thus is now turning its attention towards the western brigade. If the IDF does in fact take over the entire western part of the city, the IDF will end up right adjacent to the Moasi refugee camp, which is the humanitarian area where large contingents of internally displaced Palestinians are being housed. The IDF announced that the current expansion of the Khan Yunis operation is going to take several days, that it is aiming to dismantle the main Hamas military outfit in the region. Moving on to the city of Rafah, Palestinian news agencies reported substantial bombings in the areas surrounding the Rafah crossing. No reports were made about this in the IDF reports. Other news, amidst the ongoing reports that the Israeli political establishment is soon going to decide if the IDF is in fact going to take over the city of Rafah and what type of activity the IDF is going to deploy in the Philadelphia line, the line that separates the Gaza Strip from Egypt. The head of Egyptian communications, Deir Rashwan, today put out a statement stating that any Israeli action aimed at taking over the Philadelphia line will be a serious and dangerous threat to Egyptian-Israeli relations. Regarding casualties, 3 IDF soldiers were reported killed in the Gaza Strip in the last 24 hours, and in addition to other IDF soldiers that died from injuries, the total number of IDF soldiers that have died in the Gaza Strip since the invasion began is now 200. 19 IDF soldiers reported injured in the Gaza Strip in the last 24 hours. The Palestinian Health Ministry is reporting 190 Palestinians were killed in the Gaza Strip in the last 24 hours, bringing the total number of Palestinians that were killed in the Gaza Strip since the war began to 25,295. Just over 63,000 Palestinians are reported injured since the war began, and there are also still several thousand Palestinians that are reportedly buried under the rubble and presumed dead. Moving on to the humanitarian situation, amidst this report of the ongoing battles in Khan Yunis, different reports came in that the IDF stormed the El Hir hospital in the western areas of Khan Yunis, arrested some of the workers, while releasing the women and children towards the humanitarian corridors that lead towards the city of Rafah. The Palestinian Red Crescent also reported that IDF tanks are surrounding the El Amal hospital, as there are other reports that the IDF is also surrounding the Nasser hospital. There's already been reports that Hamas has been using the Nasser hospital to launch both rockets towards Israel and mortars towards the IDF. Right now, the reports are that the IDF tanks are surrounding both El Amal and Nasser hospital. On the news, hundreds of Palestinians were seen evacuating Khan Yunis towards the city of Rafah amidst these ongoing escalations, and this led to increasing fears and different statements that came out, expressing concern that the infrastructure in Rafah is going to eventually collapse, since Rafah is now actually housing the vast majority of Palestinians from the entire Gaza Strip. Upwards of 1.9 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are currently internally displaced. Other news related to the humanitarian situation, the New York Times today reported that the United States, the United Kingdom, and the EU are mounting pressure on Israel to allow substantial increase of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip by allowing humanitarian aid to come into the Ashdod port of Israel and then enter Gaza through the Kerem Shalom crossing. According to the report, these different countries were encouraged by the report that Israel is going to allow flour to enter in this way. This was a statement made by the White House last week. It has not actually been reported in Israel what the mechanism is going to be. And that the countries hope that expanding humanitarian aid to enter through the Ashdod port will allow a substantial increase of aid, rather than having it in the current situation go through Egypt, then arrive in Israel for inspection, and then only be transferred to the Gaza Strip. According to the report, these countries hope that they will be able to convince Israel that this will allow Israel to increase humanitarian aid and therefore gain more support internationally, while at the same time having all of the aid completely under its control and therefore maintaining exclusive rights of inspection. Moving on to the West Bank, one political report came in Sky News in Arabic that reported that the Palestinian Authority has agreed to accept the deal that was brokered by the United States and Norway, wherein it will accept transfer of the funds of the tax money that Israel has sent through Norway that will get to the West Bank. Israel has said that it is deducting the portion that is destined for the Gaza Strip. The report And Sky News did not say that the Palestinian Authority accepted the deduction as well. It simply said it is agreeing to the mechanism and is going to see if funds are in fact deducted. Moving on to the northern parts of Israel, southern parts of Lebanon, there were continuous missiles sent from southern Lebanon, specifically anti-tank missiles, towards Israel, however, much fewer than in recent days. 2 anti-tank missiles were launched towards the Batsat River area, landing in open spaces. Regarding IDF retaliations, the IDF carried out an attack in the Maruna Ras area, targeting military compound with Hezbollah operatives. After the attack, substantial secondary explosions were seen. According to the IDF, this confirmed the presence of substantial weaponry that was stored there. Other attacks targeting lookout posts and Hezbollah infrastructure were reported in Meruchin, Sichin, Taiba, and Tir Kharfa. The Saudi Al Hadith News Network reported that 1 Lebanese person was killed and 3 were injured in an IDF attack against a house in Majd al-Salam as well. There was no report made about who was the target of that attack. Other news, Minister Gantz today met with French Defense Minister Sébastien Lecornu, in which he stated that Israel is coming to the point in which it will have no choice but to operate militarily in Lebanon. Amidst this, yesterday there was a report that came out that senior officers in the IDF's Northern Command sent a letter calling upon the government in Israel to change the equation vis-a-vis Hezbollah. According to what they requested, Israel should coordinate with the United States a public announcement that Israel will cease all fire in the north for 48 hours, but will retaliate against the next Hezbollah attack with disproportionate, overwhelming force. Relating to this today, the Lebanese Adir newspaper published Hezbollah's response, reiterating that as far as Hezbollah is concerned, the Lebanese front cannot be discussed without a cessation of the war in Gaza. The paper specifically quoted Hezbollah sources stating, and I quote, that is one of many suggestions international representatives gave in order to neutralize the Lebanese front. But we made clear that there is no solution in Lebanon unless there is also a solution in Gaza. Importantly also, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant stated today that he rejects this idea as well. He stated in a meeting with French Defense Minister that even if Hezbollah stops the fire, Israel will not stop its fire until it guarantees the safe return of its civilians to the northern parts of Israel, which requires changing the security reality and the equation with Hezbollah. Other reports, Walid Jumblat, who is one of the main Druze leaders of Lebanon, stated today that he is holding active talks with both Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah and Speaker of the House Nabih Berri, and that all are meeting together in an attempt to avoid a war with Israel. Other news related to Syria, the Syrian Human Rights Observatory reported today that Syrian Air Force intercepted an IDF drone in the Quneitra area. This was not confirmed by other reports in Syria or in Israel, so unclear what this report is relating to. Moving on to some of the regional developments, Houthi spokesperson Yahya Saria claimed today that the Houthis attacked a U.S. freight ship off the coast of Aden with nautical missiles. The United States did not officially respond. A U.S. official was quoted in some different reports denying that such attack occurred. We'll probably find out more about this in the coming days. The Houthis have repeatedly said that they are now going to start targeting U.S. and U.K. ships as well as a result of the strikes that were leveled against Yemen. Moving into some of the political and general trends of the last 24 hours, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, put out an announcement that its decision regarding the injunctions that South Africa asked for, calling upon Israel to completely halt its actions in the Gaza Strip, is going to be given in the coming days. It's important to note that while South Africa has asked the court to order Israel to stop all activity in the Gaza Strip, the court does not have to actually adhere to that request when issuing an injunction. In other words, it can even deny South Africa's request, but it can issue different injunctions towards Israel, such as allowing humanitarian aid to enter unconditionally, not using different types of weapons, and all kinds of things like that. What will happen is after the court gives its ruling, this will be transferred over to the United Nations, because the ICJ is actually the judicial arm of the United Nations, and then, if they order Israel to do something, there's no actual mechanism to compel Israel to do so. However, Israel will likely be subject to substantial international sanctions and condemnations by the United Nations and the Security Council if it does not abide by the court's ruling. Other political news is convention of the EU foreign ministers starting today in Brussels, with the focus expected to be on the Israel-Hamas war. Israeli and Palestinian Authority foreign ministers are also attending. The French foreign minister stated prior to the beginning of the meeting that he hopes the EU will place sanctions on violent Israeli settlers in the West Bank because this is constantly endangering the entire region. The EU foreign minister Joseph Borrell also put out a statement saying that Israel's methods to destroy Hamas in the Gaza Strip have been simply wrong. Other political news, there were additional protests today in Israel of family members of hostages. Some of these met with Prime Minister Netanyahu, while others burst into different Knesset meetings and led to their disbanding of several meetings. Other news, Iran International, which is a British news outlet that's affiliated with Iranian opposition, published a report today that Iran has been sending increased funds and transfers to Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad since the war began, elaborating on this mechanism, but primarily stating that hundreds of millions of dollars have been transferred since the war began, as Iran hopes to keep Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad alive for as long as possible. Other political news, White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said that the U.S. believes the two-state solution is still viable and will require compromise from all sides. Added that normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia is possible, and that while Israel has a right to defend itself, hospitals should not be a war zone and they should be as protected as possible. Related to this idea of Saudi Arabia and regarding the future of the Gaza Strip, Wall Street Journal published additional reports about this regional development, regional peace plan that the United States is hoping to develop. According to the report, in addition to Saudi Arabia, 5 different Arab countries are involved in developing the day after plan that will be, on the one hand, complete normalization with Israel and recognizing Israel and their right to exist on the one hand. On the other hand, will also include a complete ceasefire and what they call irreversible steps towards a Palestinian state. According to the report, Israel outright rejected any such notion of a plan when it was presented by Secretary of State Antony Blinken because it involves these irreversible directions towards a Palestinian state. However, that both Saudi Arabia, the United States, and these different 5 Arab countries are still working on this plan in hopes that they will be able to entice Israel into at least negotiating about it in the future. That is my report for the last 24 hours. I'll be back tomorrow.